In 2004, I was in a mountain bike accident that I created. Tore off every tendon in my left shoulder. That took a year of rehab. Guess what the exercise was to rehab? Piano. But you had to play Russian style. Hands, elbows up against that was Russian style. So I persevered in that, and I finally recovered from that, which took a number of years. And then, safety belts are good for you. They're supposed to save your life. Well, in my Toyota, I reached down to put my seat belt on. It grabbed my thumb and took it over here.
Oh, no.
And you can see the difference. This one right here does this kind of thing. The other one doesn't do that. So I'll be the only 86-year-old pianist playing today in the Valley with 9 fingers. So I'm actually doing this as a memory of my mother, who made it possible for me to travel the world and to have experiences that I didn't regard as terrific until I got older. But in 1957, I went to LA on a jury. That wasn't a competition, it was a judging. And I met this judge who became my benefactor. And he provided me with music. I have music's 125 years old out there. He studied with Alberto Jonas, who was one of the great Spanish concert pianists, who was a pupil of Anton Rubinstein and associated with Liszt. The biggest hit that I found and didn't understand is he was trained by Emil von Zauer, who was a pupil of Liszt, which was unbelievable. And so the piece that I will play was my mother's absolute favorite, and Suspiro, was purported by Frederick Clement, who was Liszt's last pupil. In 1885, he performed in Rome, Lamont, and Liszt was there. Liszt died in 1886, and he requested that piece to be played. And Lamont said that was his favorite number when it came to being relaxed and enjoy the piano as he created it. So I'm playing on a bowl of mine, the Steinway, but I couldn't play on that Steinway. I hardly play on this one, but you'll put up with that. But I was telling Stephen, when I was in Paris, I flew from Paris to Estonia, and on the flight was Franz Mohr, M-O-H-R, who was Horowitz's tutor. And he traveled with him. Everywhere Horowitz played, he had his own piano and he had his tuner. So I asked him the question, because Horowitz was famed for being able to play octaves like they danced in the stars, He said nobody could play on his piano because he had all the repeaters, which is a mechanical issue, so loose that he could fly with it. Well, guess what? I ended up doing that to my Steinway. And actually my dear friends, and I live on their estate and they have a piano, and I have done the same thing to that. So I'm probably the only one who could play on it, but it fits my style. I need all the help I can get.
I'm not paying for you tuning it anymore now that I know that.
So I'm going to try to do these by memory, but I don't guarantee anything. And I kind of gained some degree of confidence when I read that Alfred Cortot, who was the eminent Chopin interpreter, all of his colleagues said he was the best of all interpreting Chopin. And they said, and he makes a lot of mistakes. But don't listen to the mistakes, because he'll play the right ones when he wants to. And he was a very lyrical performer on most of his stuff. Well, my mother would be 106 years old today, and she started me off, and one of the biggest challenges, the first big challenge, was fantasy impromptu, which has a strange 3 against 4 combination. For a kid 10 years old, that was a little bit challenging. So even though I have 77 years experience on this, I ain't guaranteeing anything. So we're going to try this one. Hopefully my fingers will cooperate. This next number was a number my mother heard on the radio. We didn't have TV then. Early times, kids. Stephen, you haven't had that experience. Yeah, we had, I think I was 11. She heard this artist play the number I will play now, which was Liszt's favorite, purportedly stated, my mother's favorite. And she had invited her out to our house to play that number, which ultimately I have played, I don't know where, all around the world really where I've been. I've played this number on pianos that were famed pianos, which was a privilege I had. This is a challenge now. because my thumb gets in the way, unfortunately. But if you'll bear with me, this is a marvelous number, and it is, every time I play it, of course I think of my mother. This last number was probably the A-flat Polonaise with the Hungarian Rhapsody number 2 and the Moonlight Sonata are the three most famous works for the piano. I heard Rubinstein play it when I was 12, and what motivated me to try to learn it was at that time. I played it for 8th grade assembly at Glendale Unit 1, and the auditorium is the only thing still there. So I guess it survived the piano deal for that part. But I'll tell you, the The biggest challenge that one faces at my age is lapses that occur unexpectedly. You have no control of for some reason. And it's very irritating, to say the least. Now this number is the one that challenges my octaves, and it took me 4 years to get to be able to play this, but because this was a number that I learned when my mother was instrumental in sitting there for every lesson. She was right there for the first year and took piano lessons with me. After that, she said I passed her up and she wouldn't do it anymore. So she didn't come to the lessons anymore, which was kind of a relief. So I'm going to try to see if I can get through this one. This is a marvelous number, and I love this number. If I can get my head together, we'll be all right.